Homer Sykes, privileged to have you on Ffoton and to have a chat about your career. One thing I'd like to go right back to the very, very beginning. And you went to boarding school. Your dad was an avid amateur photographer.
I don't know that he was an avid amateur photographer. He was a holiday photographer. He was very, very much older than my mother, 20 years. And I suppose before I got to know him, he had probably been an avid amateur photographer. But the time I got to know him, he was a holiday photographer rather than an avid amateur photographer.
Do you still have his work? Do you still have a family album?
I don't have a family album that he might have made, but I have all of my family albums that I did from the age of about 13 or 14, I suppose. And
what sort of stuff were you photographing at that age?
At that point, I was photographing when we went away on a holiday. And by the time I was 14, 15, I was photographing girlfriends and printing and doing stuff in the darkroom at school. And just being an average amateur photographer with a keen interest in having a darkroom as well.
Who were your inspirations in those days? Were you looking at other people's work, or were you looking at photographic books?
At 14 or 15, no, I was looking at amateur photographer. and just reading amateur photographer and reading and learning how to do things from amateur photographer and going out and doing them, basically. So I was learning to pan and photograph people in the streets and doing some landscapes and then that's what I was doing. Then when I went to France, when I went on holiday with my father, we did a lot of driving. I was doing a sort of a project, and it was a sort of project, I suppose I was 16 or 17, we used to drive through France and then through to Italy, and I photographed a lot of dumped cars at the side of the road. It was just, I don't know when it was, mid-50s. In France, there was still a lot of cars just dumped at the side of the road, and I spent quite a lot of time photographing those dumped cars and then printing them when I got home through tissue paper, so they went sort of blurry and not blurry, if you know what I mean. There was sort of a pattern over them. I hadn't thought about that before.
So you were experimenting quite a lot then?
I was experimenting. I was doing rayographs and I was doing some colour transparencies, but printing them on black and white paper in the darkroom. So the tones were all reversed, and doing blurred pictures and doing all that sort of art photography, which what you might call art photography today.
Did you have a mentor at all? Or was this all, were you driving yourself into this direction of photography?
No, I was doing it myself, really.
All right.
There was nobody. I was at school. I was a schoolboy. I had my own darkroom at this point in the eaves of the art school. And I guess, I was doing art, O-level art and A-level art, and it was considered at school to be, though it wasn't part of any of the exams, it was me being artistic, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So you learned a lot about light by studying art, I guess?
No, I never thought about light. Isn't that weird? It was just something that we have. I didn't think about light at all. I just thought about the end product. I never thought about light at all. And the truth is, today I don't think a lot about light unless it's really bad. And I try to get in, like, am I really bad? I mean really bright bad. Like last weekend we had Mediterranean light, and the pictures would have been great if the weather had been British. If you know what I mean.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, just so hot and so bright. No, I'm not a person that. Obviously, I do think about light. I worry about light. I spent my life worrying about it, and I guess thinking about it. Where is it coming from? Blah blah. All the things you have to think about. But at that point in my before my career, I never thought about light particularly. I just went and took pictures.
And you went on a trip with your mates. You went grape picking, and that was and it was World Cup time. I read somewhere, and and you went to the back streets. Was it Marseille? You went to the back streets of?
Yeah, what we did, we went in the summer holidays. I suppose I was 17 or 18, and 1966. So I was 17. We went down to pick grapes. We got as far as Marseille, and we went to a camping site there. And as I've said in the past, I don't know what happened to the grape picking business, but by this time I was using a Helena 35X, I think, and while they were all watching the football on whatever it was on that fateful day when we beat West Germany, I was photographing in the back streets of Marseille the deserted streets basically, and just general life there that I found as I wandered round.
What did you find fascinating about doing that? What drove you to, maybe not the liking of football, but why go to the back streets of Marseille? What clicked in your head and thought, that's a really good thing for me to do?
I don't know that anything clicked in my head. I just didn't want to watch the football. I had no interest in watching the football. And I was just very keen to go and explore with my camera and to see what was going on. That might have been clicking in my head, but it wasn't clicking in my head. It wasn't like, oh, I want to go and do this. It was just, I wanted to go and explore. And I've always thought, in a way, that a camera is that passport that does allow you to go and explore and to see how other people are living and working and doing the things they do that are completely alien to you.
And another quote from you is, you always try to go through a door that's shut, and I suppose that's indicative of the way you've worked throughout your career, I guess.
Yes, I mean, I've always tried to, I've always been, you know, as you're working as a magazine photographer or as a photographer, you know, there are barriers put up, not very many if you approach them properly. And I was always interested in actually trying to see a little bit more than what was just presented. And I think that quote was basically, I know that quote was, I was photographing a miner's, not a miner's strike, a miner's vote in the Kent coalfields. And just going down with a bunch of other press photographers. I was shooting for an agency in Paris called Viva. You know, you just get people voting, and that's basically boring. You know, they put ballots in a box and then they disappear. But I was very aware that there was other stuff going on, like they were still being miners. And if I just walked through that door, life carried on as normal. I was with a small group of other photographers. They all did their stuff and went home. I opened that door and walked in and made some quite interesting pictures, I think. So that's always what I've tried to do, is just go a little bit further than what's initially presented.
Did you encounter barriers from the people who were hiring you then, or were they excited by the work that you were presenting with them, other than other photographers?
I've never really, I don't think I've ever had barriers from the people that were employing me. People employed me because I gave them more than what they wanted. Oh, I like to think people employed me because I gave them more than other photographers gave them, I think. And I think I would like to feel I saw things slightly differently. I was always very busy then, so I guess I was definitely giving them more than other guys were giving them.
You talk about David Hurn in some of your interviews. What sort of influence did he have on you?
He was enormous influence. I mean, I ran into David in the second year at college, beginning of the second year at college. So we're pre 1967 or 68, maybe the very beginning of 68, maybe the end of 67. And he and Bill Jay were doing a job share, I think. I don't quite know the mechanics of what they were doing, but David was in college and he was looking at the work. You know, in those days there were big washing tanks in the kind of common area out of the dark room, and he would look at my work and would comment and talk to me about stuff. And I was living quite close to him. I lived in a squat at that point in St John's Wood, and he was living in Portchester Court in Bayswater, and it was a short bus ride. And he said, come down to my place and show me your work. I suppose that's what he must have said. And I used to go down and show him my contact sheets over and above all the stuff in college, obviously. And he showed me his contact sheets, and he talked to me about photography and about reportage photography and how to form pictures in a cohesive manner. And I learned a great deal from him. And I used to go down very, very regularly. And then I eventually moved much closer to him when I left the squat, and would go around almost every afternoon. At one point, definitely almost every afternoon. And I think I was probably a bit of a pest, but I used to sit around and, just hang out, basically. So he was an enormous influence.
Well, what were the main pointers that he gave you? Or was he, knowing David, he loves photography. He loves taking photographs. I mean, it's his life, and it's become your life. But what were the skills, or what were the things that he taught you that you still use today as part of your work?
I suppose in a way it was partly, or maybe I picked it up along the way, how you approach people you're photographing, how you deal with the initial contact. And that was one thing I would have picked up and developed with experience of life. But also he just talked to me about photographing stuff in a way that was honest and sincere and meant something to you and didn't upset the people you were photographing. So you wouldn't go in and, I'm the photographer and here I am, and take control. You'd be much more observant and watch and wait and hang around. Those are the sort of things I learnt from him. I don't think he taught me that, because that I don't think can really be taught. He just was enthusiastic about what I was doing, because by this time I was beginning to work on my traditional English country customs, and he was interested in that body of work. And I, of course, was shooting on a Leica with a 50mm lens, and was very much influenced as well by Cartier-Bresson and that whole way of seeing and doing things, which is what David was very influenced by as well. And it was an osmosis process, really. I picked up all this stuff because I was just always there, and I kind of fell more in love with photography from sitting around in his office and in his living room and just sort of absorbing the atmosphere. So it was a process of him, teaching, I think is kind of an odd word. It was encouragement and enthusiasm and an osmosis process, I think that would be fair to say. It might also be fair to say that I might have been one of his first pupils. I don't know. I know when I was sitting around and chatting to him, and he was at that time still living in London, obviously, and he was beginning to think. I remember the conversations being about setting up a documentary school in Wales. But that was a long, I mean, I was just kind of hanging about, basically.
In those days, you talk as well about there's a lack of contrast today when you talk about the class system. When you were photographing, and I noticed, you know, that you have this, the toffs and the working class, and that sort of amalgamation of two classes together works beautifully, but there you have a lack of contrast today between the classes. So the dynamic has changed in many respects as far as taking photographs. How do you see, how do you compare and contrast what you did then in the 70s and what you would do now? How would you approach now, for example?
Well, I think I would approach it in exactly the same way. I mean, I don't think I do anything any different. I just go and, you know, obviously I make phone calls, I phone people up, say I'm going to come and photograph, because I still photograph. I don't photograph for magazines anymore. I photograph for myself on traditional country events still. And I just go along and introduce myself and tell them what I'm doing. Again, I've already spoken to them, I've already emailed them, I've sent them a web link, you know, so, you know, you put the package together so they know you're turning up. Not always, 95% of the time. And I just look for stuff that I've always looked for. I like the way people dress. I like what that tells you about society and about them, as it did 40, 50 years ago. I've been photographing for 50 years. It's 2018, I started really properly thinking about taking documentary pictures in 1968. And I just really look for the same sort of things that I've always looked for. People interacting, being natural, being normal, putting them against a background that is relevant to the stuff I'm photographing. I think a lot about the background. I mean, the background for me is almost as important as the foreground. If the background doesn't work and the foreground's great, it ain't going to make a decent picture unless it's a news picture. You know, a news picture, doesn't matter what's happening in the background because it's that kind of dynamic moment in the foreground that nobody else has got, and you've got a great news picture. But if you're photographing or taking pictures of everyday life, and that's what I'm doing, albeit special occasions that take place every year, the background is absolutely crucial to set the scene, and that's got to work as well as the foreground.
In that respect, you must spend a lot of time when you go to an event. What are you looking for first? Are you looking for the background? Are you looking for the people? I mean, how does it all work together? Or is that a serendipitous moment that it just happens?
Well, sometimes it just happens, but I'm thinking, you know, I'm looking at the foreground. I'm looking at what people are doing, how they're interacting, what they look like, whether they, along with the background, can set the scene, basically, whether it can all marry together. And also, of course, is it a bit fun? Is it slightly quirky? Does it kind of, you know, does it work for me? So I was in Mediterranean Yorkshire last weekend. It was the hottest day that England had recorded for years. Contrast was shocking, but I got some nice pictures, and and it would have been a better picture if the light had been softer and more English. And I've got a bus stop, and I've got all these people singing hymns, standing in the shade of a building by the bus stop. That's not a main picture in the little set I'm shooting, but it kind of worked. It made a point. It's actually kind of quite a nice picture because it looks like it's a bus cube, but they're all singing hymns. And so I'm looking for little things that are slightly quirky. It's North Yorkshire, you've got dark, satanic buildings. I'm trying to get those all to fit together with whatever people are doing. I'm just looking to bring all that stuff together so that it makes good visual editorial sense.
Yes. And your revisiting of festivals and in England, are you finding those festivals, they've grown, I guess, most of them?
they've grown enormous, and I'm not really revisiting many. I thought I was going to do that to start with, but I've actually found that the festivals and customs I photographed 45 years ago-ish, there are just too many people there photographing, and it's just boring, basically. And I'd much rather photograph stuff that other people are not photographing, or not photographing very often, or just local people have got their iPhones out and are making some pictures. So I'm trying to find stuff that is just very low-key, very, very small, very local, and I'm perhaps the only photographer there, or the only non-local photographer there. So I've been to events that are in the last few years where I think I'm probably the only person other than the local photographer that's ever photographed them. I mean, they're not in the books. I'm looking for stuff that you can't find in the books and can't find easily on the internet, basically.
Yeah. Are you shooting digitally now?
Yeah. I've been digital since 2000. It just to me, it makes better sense to be digital. It's free once you've digied up. I think the quality is just as good. You can shoot colour and black and white all at once. It's simple. And you have wonderful control. I mean, one of the things about having a sort of a computer darkroom is you get all the control, and you can, if it doesn't work out, when you're sort of equivalent of dodging, you can redo it on. It's computer technology. It's Photoshop, and it's a great way of doing all the things you couldn't get perfectly right in a darkroom 40 years ago, because perhaps you weren't experienced enough.
Yes, indeed. And you did all your own printing, I guess, in those. Well, you obviously did do all your own printing, did you? Or did you farm it out to printers and tell them what to do?
Well, to start with, I did all my own printing, and then when I got busy and was making money as a magazine photographer, I farmed it out because I was too busy, and there are other people who are better at doing things than you are.
Indeed so.
And therefore it's all being paid for, so you might as well have them do it, basically, and you get on with the next job. But I was always pretty particular, as I had good people doing my stuff for me, thankfully.
So long-term projects are important to you?
I've always worked on long-term projects. I mean, I started a project on traditional English country customs, second year at college, and I'm still doing it, albeit it's changed slightly over the years. It's still something I'm interested in, still something I'm doing. We've just talked about that a little bit. But also at that same period, I started photo. Because I've been at boarding school all of my life, really, since the age of 7, and I guess had obviously lived a very middle-class lifestyle. I came to London when I was 18, 19, and went to college, and everything was new. I hadn't seen any of sort of that side of society before, and became interested in documenting it and going on demonstrations and seeing how other people lived. And that's how I think a camera can be a passport. It can help you kind of interact or visit other places and see what people are doing, and it's a good excuse for being there, really. If you present yourself correctly, if your face fits in the old-fashioned Fleet Street terminology, and you present yourself and you're not pushy, you can wheedle your way, and you don't have to make long conversation for hours. You can get in, you can chat, you can be friendly, and you can see the most amazing things still. It's a fantastic tool for meeting people and seeing how other people live and how privileged we are as photographers in our own lives, and being a photographer. You have a great reason to explore, and far more so than being a journalist, funnily enough. Journalists can go in, but they can't actually make pictures. And when you bring out a writing pad, a tape recorder or whatever, but if you present yourself as a photographer in a slow way, you can see amazing things, amazing things, and make a record of it that it can be used forever.
So, what sort of relationship did you have? I mean, when you were going out and shooting, did you have? I mean, approaching people. Would you approach people, or was it specifically at some times? How much time would you spend talking to them before you photographed them? Was there any element of that involved in your work?
Well, no. I mean, there are two questions there.
Yes.
When I first started out, I just looked for things that I found. I went to events, be it a demonstration or whatever, and I looked for things that I found interesting. So I have, pictures from very early on, 68. There's I would like to think, a fairly classic picture of three young Tories in Trafalgar Square wearing their bowler hats. They've actually holding rolled umbrellas, though you can't see it in the picture, and they're in their old school ties. And I've managed to get them with a sign behind them on Trafalgar Square on the Plinth Nelson's column that says "Forward Again with the Tories." So I was at that demonstration in 1968. It was a "Forward Again with the Tories" demo, I guess. And I was looking for stuff that said something about what was going on. And you have to look at my contact sheets, but there are a few pictures of this and a few pictures of that, nothing particularly interesting. And then I remember very clearly, I found these three guys, maybe there were four of them, and they looked absolutely perfect. So I didn't speak to them, I walked around them, you can see it on the contact sheet, I took pictures, they weren't concerned about me, and I made, the perfect picture-ish, I hope. When they turned around to look behind them at people yelling "Ya Boo" from the steps of the National Gallery, that was the moment I made the picture. So I got them facing away from where they had been facing before, listening to the speaker, watching the people shouting "Ya Boo," but I got the sign in that said "Forward Again with the Tories." So it works. You can see there's a context there. And then there are other pictures I might have photographed in the East End where I would run into people and try to get myself invited back into their flats or apartments, and you'd make small talk. And how long did that small talk go on for? Not very long. You would chat and they'd say, "Do you want a cup of tea?" And you'd say you'd love a cup of tea, and you'd wander back and you'd go into their flats with them or homes with them and sit around and make small talk, and then you were always thinking, "I want to make some pictures, and how is this going to work?" And I'd say, "Do you mind if I take some pictures?" And they would normally say, "Fine." In those days, they didn't say why, and they would say that now, I'm quite sure, but in those days, I don't recall people saying why. It was just something. I was there. They knew I was a photographer. I'd presumably photographed them on the street to start with. And then I just chatted and said, "Hello, blah, 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 blah." What I don't know. And then I'd get invited in and I'd make some pictures. And that used to happen from time to time, and that's kind of the way I did things. And it worked. I've got some, I did a story in Earl's Court. I was packed off by a small magazine called New Society to photograph in Earl's Court. I'm not really sure why, but but I was sent off to photograph, and I got, three or four really nice pictures. But one of a couple in a bedsit. I'd met them in the street and made a couple of pictures and got chatting to them, and they said, "Do you want to come back to have a beer with me in our room?" And she was a tattooed young lady, and he turned out was away without leave, had done a runner from the army, and I got some pictures of them just hanging out on this bed in the bedsit. Great pictures, they didn't seem to mind, and I just sat around and chatted and made some pictures with them. I got another picture, which is a cracking picture of a story I was doing at the same sort of time on poor Arabs in London. At that point, in the early 70s, the Arabs that came to London came for healthcare reasons, and some Arabs had come back to my bedsit with me, as people did, and I went, and it was perfect. He had his dinner, and and he was wearing all of his regalia, and there was a jacket hanging on a coat hanger on a nail in the wall, and his bed there. And I thought, am I going to be able to take pictures? It was all a little bit slightly dodgy. And I got a cracking good picture. And once I got my picture, I made my, departures, and I just disappeared. So to answer your question, I just made friends very quickly, very easily. And the purpose was just to get back into their homes, really, and make some pictures and see how they lived, and then move on. I never made friends with people I photographed that became a lasting relationship. I was there to make pictures. That's what I did. And I had obviously developed a technique of easing my way into people's lives and then moving on.
But the dynamic has changed considerably. You mentioned it, you spoke about it a little earlier when you said people would ask you, why are you taking photographs? And I come across that quite a lot, people asking why. And it's a very difficult question to answer. How would you answer that question today?
Well, these days I say, because I'm always working on another book or a project, and I say I'm putting together I let them know in advance I'm coming, and I say I'm working on another book project, and I am, and that seems to suffice. And then when I meet people on the street, as what I'm doing, they seem to have accepted, because I've been there for the whole of the time and said, hello, you don't mind if I photograph you, do you? I'm doing this. Or they just sometimes don't even ask. But I don't photograph people on the street. I mean, I don't do street photographs. I photograph events which are on the street.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It makes so. And people, in a way, are in a kind of bubble when they're a part of an event, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely right. Yeah.
And they're not. It's street photography. One could argue. I mean, I don't know how you feel about people teaching street photography. I've seen people with a photographer, half a dozen to a dozen people walking down the street taking photographs. I don't know what do you think about that?
Well, I've tried to teach street photography, but I don't think you can. I would never do it with a group of people I'm walking around with. I would talk to them about, and have done, about the sort of things they should be looking for, stuff that interests them. And how they kind of mentally approach going about it. And then occasionally you'd get to have to go with somebody who wasn't so good, because I was doing this at college and had really no idea. And you would actually physically show them how to take the picture, and what they should be including and not. And that's kind of how I taught that. And then they have to develop themselves. Street photography is all really about developing an eye that you as a personal photographer, you find interesting.
Indeed. I've found Jehovah's Witnesses quite interesting. Of late, photographed quite a lot of them on bridges and in town centres, and actually stood in front of them for a long time. Yeah. And they've not batted an eyelid. Yeah. And it's and the way they interact with people, I find that quite interesting dynamic. When and obviously you do. It's when people come together and the way they react to what's being said, or their hand gestures or whatever. But it is a fascinating world. And I mean, one could probably call you Mr. Documentary England, I guess.
Well,
Could we?
I don't know. You could call me Mr. Documentary England, but I have been documenting England, primarily England, Britain, for 50 years, probably longer than anybody else at the moment. Of course, there's Ian Berry and David Hurn, but I mean, Ian has really photographed the whole world and not specifically England. And David's photographed Wales very extensively, but not particularly England. And I think I've probably been documenting Britain longer than anybody else, but that would be most controversial. And I said that to a colleague, and he said, "Oh, no." I said, "Well, hang on. Who else has been doing it since 1968? You know, lots of people have photographed bits here, bits there, but never across a whole career. I can't think of anybody who has. I mean, I really can't. So, you know, I mean, you can, you know, I have colleagues in Magnum who've been photographing Britain very extensively, but only from about 1972 or 73. I've been doing it since 1968, and they're all older than me. I just started a little bit younger than my generation of photographers. So none of my generation of photographers have quality work from 68.
Right. And you still find photography fascinating and an obsession, I guess. I mean, all photographers are obsessed, I think.
Yeah, it's an obsession. Photography is not an obsession anymore. Photography certainly was an obsession. Documentary, reportage photography was what obsessed me in the early days. I just like working, basically, I mean I'm not work shy, and I spend a great deal of time working. I want to make the I have become obsessed with traditional English country customs. I've been doing it for 50 years, not quite 40 years certainly. Yeah, and it costs a lot of time and energy to do all of that. I don't think I'm obsessed anymore by it. I just do it because it's a habit. Yeah, you know, it's what I do. So I don't think I'm obsessed. Not anymore. I was certainly. I don't feel compelled the way I used to, but I still go and do all this stuff constantly, you know.
Yes, yeah.